it all situated real quickly. So I do have one thing to say beforehand. Jennifer Cates, who is a Penn Law graduate, 07, and is Chief of Staff of Philadelphia Councilwoman Helen Yim's outfit over at City Hall, sent me a last-minute message saying she couldn't make it to a medical emergency. So she was really going to talk a lot in broader terms about political strategy, leverage, and other aspects within City Hall and around City Hall that kind of goes into the local legislative process. That being said, our capable panelists, by the way, I've gotten to know now over the course of the last few months putting this together, and who are all amazing people. We're really lucky to have them here. Our panelists are definitely able to speak towards kind of the work that goes on politically, the drafting of legislation, supporting legislation, and the process, and obstacles that practitioners face in trying to both identify problems that can be fixed by local legislation, and also those kind of strategies that go into resolving those issues. All of our panelists have worked closely with Ms. Cates over the years, so although it would be great to have her, we still are going to have a good time here. So with that, I'm Paul Kotler. I'm a 2L from right outside of Philadelphia. I went to Penn undergrad as well. I grew up outside of Philadelphia. I haven't left. So, love this place. Go Birds. At this point, I want to introduce you guys to our panelists who will come up here and sit in their assigned seats that I've made. Once everybody's up there, then we'll get started. By the way, just a show of hands. Anybody here a 3L? Okay, got a few here. How about 2Ls? Okay, and 1Ls? Amazing, awesome. That's great. I'm very happy that we have kind of a diverse group of students here who are interested in the subject and who also may want to just get fired up by 3 really accomplished practitioners out in the field. But given kind of the current status of our politics, local legislation is more important than ever. Nothing's really happening in DC. Nothing's really getting through. And so when there are issues that need to be dealt with, where injustices, where people are not getting the right representation that they need, or where people's rights are not getting the right representation that they need in court and in the legislative process, local legislation ends up taking over that kind of role and becomes much more important. And for those older students who've already had experience in the legislative class or statutory interpretation class, you already know this, and 1Ls, you will learn it soon. And I know you 1Ls also just want some food and to get away from civil procedure for a little bit. So, without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists. Karen Harvey, to my right, is a grassroots activist and organizer who is with Philly Tenants Union and works very closely with housing rights issues in Philadelphia. Karen's background as a social worker and as someone who has actually been, whose kind of relationship to this subject is much more direct than mine or many of ours, in that Karen was herself a victim of kind of this mass eviction problem that Philadelphia has been experiencing, has kind of given her a unique perspective, and also will kind of allow us to expand our perspective into not only what it means and how important this kind of legislation or this process that we go through is, but also that there is a human side to all of this. To Karen's right is Margaret Nurston, a Virginia undergrad graduate, and actually is also involved in Philly Tenants Union. Is a new is a transplant to Philadelphia, but has done quite a lot in her short time here so far as an organizer and activist for Philly Tenants Union. And Margaret has a lot of fire and passion for what we're doing. Is an architect, right?
Yes. I'm unlicensed, so I can't legally say that.
Okay.
I can only colloquially say that.
Well, I'm in a law school classroom, and I look like a law professor right now. So me saying it, I'm saying it's legal, so it is. Or we can go through a legislative process to make it happen. And then to Margaret's right is Rashida Phillips, a managing attorney in the housing unit for community legal services, who is a graduate of Temple Law School and has been working on the ground in the courtroom on identifying issues that need to be dealt with or that can be resolved effectively through legislation, and then also has been working very hard throughout the process of drafting legislation, through research, dealing with obstacles like state and federal preemption, and working on coordinating kind of a lot of the different roles that are involved in this whole process. So we're really happy to have all you guys here. This is really exciting. So basically what we're going to do today is the first part of our discussion is going to be, and I will be done talking soon, the first part of our discussion is going to be kind of about the different roles that are played in this collaborative process. Basically, the reason that I really wanted to put this on, and thank you to PLA, Penn Law Advocates for the Homeless, the Guild Stamp Pro Bono Project, and then also the Housing Rights Project at Penn for supporting and helping put this together. And thank you to all of TPIC and Hillary and Victoria Gillison, who got the food here and have been working behind the scenes to make Public Interest Week a really kind of not only educational experience, but also to fire you guys up and take you away from the drag of law school and into kind of what's going on outside the building. So our first part, we're going to focus on the kind of the different roles that are being played in this process by practicing lawyers like Rashida, who are on the front lines, who are in City Hall, who are writing amicus briefs and writing to kind of show the legal side of why this legislation can be passed and what it needs to be passed, and also the role Rashida and Margaret and Karen can share kind of the role that organizers and supporters in the streets and in the field play in supporting this legislation, identifying problems, and kind of bringing anecdotes and the human side to the table. And then we can also all kind of, since we've worked with Jennifer Cates and other representatives of City Hall, we can also kind of speak to that as well. So let's start with Rashida. So working with community legal services, can you take us kind of through what your on its face, what your role kind of in the legislative process and in local legislation is?
Sure. So first, if folks aren't familiar with Community Legal Services, we're a nonprofit legal services organization primarily based in Center City. We also have a North Philadelphia office, and we provide free legal representation to low-income Philadelphians across a broad range of civil legal services issues. So we deal with employment, we deal with Social Security, public benefits, consumer housing issues, home ownership issues as well. And as Paul noted earlier, I run our housing unit, so specifically our landlord-tenant housing work, and where we provide legal representation and do policy work for low-income Philadelphians facing eviction, facing termination from their subsidy, and all issues therein. One of the unique things about working at a place like Community Legal Services is the fact that we both do direct representation and policy work. Those two things are both part and parcel to the work that we do on a daily basis. It's extremely important, and when we're talking about the legislative process and us being able to identify what's actually happening and connect those things, it's really important that we have that freedom and ability, and part of the reason why we do have that freedom is because of how we're funded. So we're funded a little bit differently than some organizations which receives funding called LSC funding, which restricts their ability to get into the legislative process and to do some of the systemic policy advocacy that we're able to do around particular subjects. So working at CLS without the restrictions, we're able to do both of those things. And so we're involved at both the local level, the state level, and the national level around various policy issues related to both tenant protections and tenant rights, as well as preservation of affordable housing, which is things that we're starting to get more and more into, particularly as we're seeing mass evictions. They've always happened, but they're occurring with some frequency, given kind of gentrification, the buzzword, but we're less concerned about gentrification and more concerned about displacement that is the impact of gentrification in the city. So in terms of the legislative process, we look at a number of different things. I can sort of focus on just cause, or do you want me to speak more generally
just
about?
to start, actually, because you did bring up, your local reach, but also your national reach. And the collaborative process is not only focused in the city itself,
Sure.
right? There are also some national components as well. Other groups like CLS that are working in different states and different cities, trying to basically do the same thing, right?
Sure. So we do a lot of, and also I want to back up a little bit just to give you a little bit of context of what housing crisis looks like here in Philadelphia. So a number of things are converging, and what you'll often hear developers and folks say is, we don't have an affordability crisis here, we have a housing standard crisis here, or we have a substandard housing crisis here. We have all of those crises here. All of those different things are converging, and on top of the fact that we're the poorest major large city with a poverty rate hovering at 26% over the past 5 years or so, probably longer than that, all of these things just deepen some of these crises here. So one of the ways in which we're experiencing a crisis is eviction. So we see, on average, 24,000 eviction filings in municipal court each year. Out of that 24,000 filings, only 5% of tenants get legal representation. Landlords get 85%. 85% of landlords get legal representation in these processes. Out of that 5%, only 1% of low-income tenants are being able to access legal services. Part of that is a capacity issue, obviously, which I can talk more about later, or not talk about at all because that's not the topic of this. So in addition to that, we are seeing a loss of both affordable housing in the private sector as well as in the subsidized housing sector. So over the next 20 years or so, we stand to lose over 9,000 units of affordable housing. Our city at this time only plans to build about 300 affordable housing units over the next couple of years, according to their housing action plan that they're currently writing. So we're not able to build to keep up with the need, and we'll never be able to build our way out of an affordability crisis. There's always going to be we're never going to be able to match the need just because of the way the system works. In addition to seeing a loss of subsidized housing, we're seeing a loss of private housing where you don't have a subsidy, you don't have any assistance, but your ability to afford it and to pay less than 30% of your income towards your housing expenses, we're seeing a loss of that kind of housing. So on average, an affordable rent here was about $750 a month, depending on your family size. We're now seeing that's no longer a reality here. Rents are skyrocketing, and our people's ability to pay and to match their income and their cost of living is very disparate. So that's kind of the context, and there's lots of other things that I could talk about. But in terms of how we work with national partners, in a lot of ways, the ways that we work with them is by modeling what they're doing or working with folks to see. So, for example, in New York, recently they passed legislation providing a right to counsel for tenants, and it's being implemented over a couple of years. But that really provided a lot of momentum for Philadelphia to look at that and to work with those folks to try to get the same thing here. So one example of that is that one of the things they did in New York was have a pro bono firm do a cost-benefit study to see what would be the cost-benefit of providing a right to counsel, and what would it save the city in terms of homelessness shelters and all of the kind of different services that folks who are being evicted or at risk of homelessness are leaning on. And the cost-benefit study bore out in such a way that they were able to use that to lean on the legislation that they wanted to pass to provide this right. So we were able to, working with them, get that same firm to do a costing out study here that will be out in the next couple of weeks that will show that if you provide a right to counsel, the money that you spend on that is going to save you millions of dollars on homelessness services, other social services, again, that folks are accessing. So that's one of the ways in which we use it. I can talk more specifically about just cause legislation in that context, but sort of the same thing. So there's just cause, exists in lots of other places around the country. We can learn from lots of other people about what that process looked like, what they were able to get, what compromises they had to make, what arguments they had to push back against landlords, because it's going to be the same arguments no matter where you go about why just cause is a bad thing for landlords and for their bottom line. So there's so much we can learn from other folks and ways that we can model our legislation or change it depending on what we've learned from other folks. So that's just one way, but there's lots of other ways.
Yeah, it's an experimenting kind of process, trial by error in some areas.
Yes.
And the nature of legislation itself is supposed to be to lay out a groundwork on how to deal with an immediate problem, but also future problems. So it's important to try and understand as well as possible, both in presenting, an idea to legislators, but also in kind of understanding, is this going to be effective in the way that we want it to be effective? It's important to try and be as solid in those areas as possible. And it sounds like statistics, surveys, the right kinds of stories or narratives need to be kind of added. And I remember when I read your, I guess, would it be called an amicus brief, or would it just be called testimony that CLS had?
Testimony.
Yeah, testimony that CLS had submitted to City Council, kind of in this stage of the process.
Sure, and I think it's going to be really powerful to hear from Karen and Margaret about how those stories really provide the momentum for anything to even actually happen, because we have been working for years on trying to get just cause legislation introduced, but it wasn't until this situation happened in a particular councilperson's district that the momentum was provided, and the stories really brought the urgency to get that legislation introduced. So it'll be interesting.
And what wonderful segue. This is not
That was
scripted at all. Okay, this was not scripted at all. We have good chemistry up here. Great segue into what Margaret and Karen do and I would put this under the category, I guess, as grassroots organizations. Not necessarily legal practitioners, although there may be legal practitioners who are involved in the group. Is that true, or are there?
Yeah, so we're an all-volunteer organization. We're not even of 501c3 status yet, which means we don't have any funding. All of our funding is just membership dues, but that provides us a really good advantage in where we don't have to answer to anyone except tenants, and that makes us really edgy, I guess. There's a lot of people power in our organization, and we have lawyers who work with us. I mean, Rashida works with us a ton, and really is a really good resource for acting as translating sort of the legalese of the legislation that we're discussing in City Hall meetings. But we also have lawyers who will explain that stuff to us, and just sort of act as translators and guidance.
That's really interesting, kind of having to communicate through two different languages. One, kind of the institutional language of what's already been put out, what are the preemptive effects that we need to know about, what are kind of the things that are not as intuitive that lawyers who are as experienced as Rashida and who have been working in state law and housing law for so long are, know like the back of their hand, and kind of being able to translate that into your vision from being on the streets and knowing kind of what are the problems and what do we want to see happen to make real change. And if you want to talk more about PTU, just to
so we were founded like early 2016. This is a year before I joined. So I'm just saying things like that I know from other members. But we basically were looking for legislation to advocate for. We focus on sort of direct tenant empowerment. It's actually really great to know how far just knowing your rights is, and so like education and outreach is really powerful, but we're also just all volunteers doing this in our free time, so doing stuff like policy and like legislative advocacy is a way for us to reach people we don't have the resources to reach. So yeah, we were just kind of shopping around for legislation, and actually Councilman Greenlee was the one who suggested Just Cause because it had been attempted to go through city council before in Philadelphia years ago, and it failed. And so we liked that legislation because it wasn't financially oriented. When we speak to tenants, it seems like the biggest policy change we need is also sort of a cultural change and something that will sort of even out the playing field between tenants and landlords. And so that's the legislation we decided to pursue. And we get a lot of people just reaching out to us randomly. So this lawyer from New Jersey was helping us draft the bill based off of other states' existing Just Cause legislation. And then we were in conversation with a lot of local folks too to sort of just personalize that for Philadelphia. I know there are other parts of the bill in other states that include homeownership rights, and we just didn't include that in this case. And then we basically just take that to city council. We tried to like minimize council people's responsibility and say like, hey, we have the bill written, like you don't have to do anything, and this won't cost any money because we don't need to get paid.
And I was going to say, you're busy doing other things rather than kind of the policy work that legislatures with their staff are doing or lawyers are doing. But also you are kind of doing interesting things, trying to bring attention to what's going on to the constituents, to the politicians themselves. Maybe you can speak, and Karen, feel free to also speak towards kind of what that's like and how that role is played in this process.
Yeah, I mean, I could start.
Sure.
Yeah, so politicians are politicians, and they love good PR, and we know that they'll respond to things like public pressure and just straight up disruption. And since we don't have to worry about losing funding from anyone, we just cause all those disruptions. So we sort of shopped. So we were in contact with Councilman Greenlee, asked if he could find any co-sponsors for the bill. He couldn't, so that was really awkward. So then we went to sort of testify and just talk about this legislation during a city council hearing. We were canceled from being scheduled to speak, so then we just sort of like shut the whole thing down and we're like yelling. And also within that past year, we had also gathered 1,000 petition signatures in support of the legislation from Philadelphia residents, and that was just us door knocking. And so we also did like a letter drop and showed how much support there was for this bill already by the public. And then we still weren't really getting answers. So then there were some housing panel events that we also crashed and were still rejected. And then there was.
What do you mean by crashed?
So we would get a group of, we would get a group of members, people, I mean, Rashida was at one of them, and it was hosted.
Very interesting.
It was hosted by Councilwoman Kim, actually, and
This is the right to counsel hearings, actually.
oh, was it? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Oh my gosh, I love that.
No, it's great.
Too.
It's
Yeah.
great.
And basically we were like,
It's disruptive.
yeah, yeah, Philly needs just cause too, and she was like, no, and then and Rashida said yes, so that was cool. As far as I know, I wasn't there. I wasn't in PT yet, but yeah, and then so like that just kept being like awkward and not effective. But then there was like a major like media travesty, which was a mass eviction that Karen can talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I preface my words by saying that I'm old enough to be most of your mothers, if not grandmothers, so you will be kind to me. Okay. I wanted to be a lawyer, which has nothing to do with Penn Win, but I was raised and went to school during the time when black kids were told that you can't be a lawyer, you can't be a teacher, you can't be a doctor, you can't be anything professional. I went to a then all-white junior high school. We got bussed in, chased home, and the counselor told me that I should focus my energies on becoming a carpenter. You don't know me, but you don't want to give me a hammer, a nail. You don't want me around glass, and you probably should hold my hand when I'm going down the steps. I am the biggest klutz you'll ever meet. Okay, so I came to know the Philadelphia Tenants Union when in 2017, the building that I lived in, called the Penguin House, in I think the neighborhood is called Winfield Heights, notified myself and the other tenants that lived in the building that we would have to leave in 3 months. They gave us notification by sliding a letter under our doors 2 days before Christmas, and basically said, you gotta go, the building's been sold, you've got 3 months to get out, and that's that. Shortly after we got the notice, maybe a month or so, suddenly these, at that time, young white kids appeared in the lobby of the Penguin, so I'm we found out that they, in fact, were representatives of the Philadelphia Tenants Union and were interested in taking our fight to the media. About a month after we met and began to work together, we had a media event outside of the building where different tenants talked about, their situation, how they got to Penguin, and how now we were going to be thrown out. And someone notified Councilman Curtis Jones. Penguin is in his district, and he showed up for the live event. I don't know if he knew about the Just Cause legislation before, but he is a politician, and he shone brightly that afternoon. But it gave us what we needed, which was some media coverage and let the city know what was going on with Penguin. I love Rashida Phillips. I've never told her, but I love her. I fall into a category of those persons who make just too much money to benefit from CLS or other publicly funded services, but not enough to be able to afford a lawyer. Okay. Rashida was just so helpful for me and other tenants in the building, even though she couldn't represent me. She took time to sit and talk with me, to tell me what my rights were, to look over my paperwork for me so that it could be filed correctly. It's through her I came to be connected with the Human Relations Commission, and we were part of a suit against the Penguin owners. We did an event downtown, outside of the building, where one of the building's owners works at 16th and Market. It used to be a PNC building, I don't know where it is now, but he came outside to talk to us. Didn't stay long. We had a woman with us, Miss Gwen, who was about 85. Strong, former teacher, able to sing her own song. And Miss Gwen confronted him on the issues, and he ran back inside and didn't hear from her anymore. Essentially, what came out of the tenants union involvement was the ability for everyone to stay in the building until we were able to find other living arrangements, so that by the end of September, everyone in the building, whether they wanted to involve themselves with the tenants union or not, was represented in some way or another, and we helped to find housing for those folks who weren't able to, and support for a lot of the tenants in the building. The Penguin House has been in existence, I think it's been there like maybe 50 years. It used to be the place where you wanted to live. My aunt moved into that building about 40 years ago and was one of the first black tenants in the building. It fell seriously into disrepair over the years. There was some misuse of funds. We discovered that for many people, the rent was never recorded as having been paid. In fact, Penguin took me to court 3 times for eviction, and each time I won my case. But an issue that followed from that is that now on my credit report, there are 3 eviction processes identified, and once they're on your credit, they stay on your credit forever. So that limited me in where I could actually go to find housing. So I ended up back in the hood, not far from where I grew up, not very far from here. And there's a whole gentrification story to go with that you probably have to go to class, so you don't have time here. But
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, but like Karen's sort of experience is like what paints like a whole picture on like what we need in terms of legislation. Like if the owners of Penguin like had to give a just reason, like a reason besides just like profit motives, like that mass eviction wouldn't have happened. And then I know that Rashida works a lot on like the eviction task force, and there's other legislation that addresses some of the things you were saying with like credit score rates and records basically.
I'll just say, the winos out there, I know you guys got class at 12:45. We understand. Feel free to go when you need to go. But it was really important to hear Karen's story. As lawyers, and we're all going to be lawyers at some point, it's really important for us to kind of balance both the objectiveness of the law that we need to have in order to be, the best advocates that we can be for our clients, whether those clients are, on Wall Street or on Broad Street. You will get as smart as me too, but it's also important to still know that there's a human side to all of this, that when you're doing big deals with this, there are employees that are going to be affected, that when you're dealing with legislation, there are people that are going to be affected. So let's just let the one else file out. But thank you so much for sharing that, Karen. Really appreciate it.
My story is not, it's not that rare.
Right.
We continue to fight for tenants who are being forced into mass eviction.
I would like to say though, as well, you know, it is important, this kind of being able to get the word out, the importance of the media in this. I know in California, where kind of the fight for legalizing gay marriage really took place, that was the battleground. Different campaigns were spending millions and millions of dollars on advertisements, voting yes, vote no for prop, you know, I forget what the numbers are, 22 or something. 8. Sorry. The importance and the role that the media plays in kind of overshadowing this whole thing is also important. What about where your roles kind of overlap? I know you guys were sharing a laugh about the right to counsel hearing that you guys were a part of, but it sounds like there was some overlap in both you know, having to speak different languages and then present that language to politicians and constituents, being able to understand what those constituents need, and if any of you would like to speak towards that kind of direct collaboration or communication, the importance of that communication in this process.
I can start off by saying, one of the interesting things is that before Councilman Jones introduced the Just Cause legislation, he had actually introduced another bill related to the Penguin situation that was very narrowly focused on kind of what was happening at Penguin, so it didn't have as broad of an applicability.
It wasn't addressing the wider issue.
Yeah, it was.
Is that usually what happens?
Sometimes that is what
you start
happens.
narrow and then start to kind of...
Sometimes that is what happens, and you'll see that a lot when there is these situations where there's kind of a reactive way of trying to cobble something together to address it, and what...
It's strategic in that way.
Yeah, it's strategic, but it's also not always a good strategy because you end up slowing down the process or introducing something that actually doesn't address the broader situation so that this situation is going to continue to happen. So I think it was really important that PTU came into this process at the point that they did and started to push this just cause, because that also attracted Curtis Jones as being the better option for what he wanted to do to address these kinds of situations. So that's a way that we have worked together in this process. One of the things, as Karen mentioned, as Ms. Harvey mentioned, we can't represent everybody. Our capacity is such that we're only going to be able to represent a certain amount of people in a given year, and they have to be at a certain income level because that's what our resources and our funding does. And so it is really, really, really important to have organizers and other collaborators when a mass eviction is happening, and for different folks to come together to be able to do different things as a part of it. So having PTU be there and be able to organize the tenants in a way that legal services lawyers just couldn't, or we just could not get out there and get to people in time in the way that PTU could, and organize residents and be willing to kind of do the things that, again, as lawyers, we kind of can't do that. We can't like make a ruckus in the same way. Like, we could, but it's going to hurt us, and it's ultimately going to hurt our clients. And so, or even coming to like eviction court and showing up, and the way PTU is able to show up in eviction court and be there to support the residents in a way that when I go into the court, I have to be an attorney, right? And I have to come a certain way and I have to talk a certain way. So I think it's been really important to have that aspect of, you know, how we address these eviction issues, especially the mass eviction issues, when we can't always get there in time or do the kind of organizing that organizers can do. So that's been really important. And I think, the edginess has worked. It has worked for us.
I was about to ask, is this crashing?
You know, it can clash. It does clash. It can be tense because, again, we have to be very strict about how we use the law, and sometimes what a tenant's right is and how it plays out are two totally different worlds. And so, again, like, for example, if we were to represent a client who we have to do a merit determination for all of our clients. Now, there may not be merit in a sort of strict sense of the word that's going to allow us to go into court with all of these defenses, and we may not be able to take that case for that reason. But a tenant going in there and representing themselves can kind of raise different things that a lawyer can't raise. So I think it's really important to have both of those things. And I think education, educating tenants on their rights is a different thing that, we also have to work together on. But I think it's been such an important partnership. And there's another organization here called Turn that does housing counseling and does some organizing rights. And for all of us to be able to work together and address these issues, I think has been really important.
And, you know, to preface, like with that, you know, kind of strategy, the crashing strategy, there's a certain amount of credibility that needs to already be in place, right, for this to be effective. You know, when there's a difference between me showing up to eviction court with a sign as opposed to PTU showing up with a sign, or there's a difference between me writing something to a council person as opposed to Rashida and CLS addressing a certain issue, right? That credibility really comes into play in this kind of environment.
Yeah, I mean, we're barely ever invited to things, but
For a
we show
reason.
up to them anyway, and it's effective.
I'm afraid Karen may break the door down.
Right, yeah, but I think it kind of, I don't know, it's effective because it's like, okay, like Rashida will be invited to the table and like knows her stuff and like will be able to have like heightened conversations about the law with lawmakers. But I mean, that's not to say you speak with us regularly and we'll be like, this is what's going on. And then we'll be like, okay, this is on our calendar now. And I don't know, it works.
Really that emotional
yeah.
landscape, it's so important because actually emotions move people. It's less the law a lot of times, and one of the things that we saw even in the right to counsel hearings, you crash, but people were moved by that, and people were moved. The whole reason why the mayor even started the eviction task force is because a tenant testified to what was happening to him and why he needed a lawyer, and so that was the whole reason. So people are moved by emotions, and they bring the emotion, they heighten the emotions, and that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing.
And not every politician has a background in law, which I think is important to take advantage of. And sometimes they need the plain language.
Know your audience.
Like
exactly.
back and forths, and having like arguments against the stuff we're trying to pass, anticipated, and then have responses for them to sort of absorb easily, so that when they're advocating in City Hall, they can do so easily.
And I think you all tell the story about in our meetings about, or even Curtis Jones says this, like he was scared that his constituents were being displaced from his district, and that's what moved him. Like that was part of it, that I'm going to lose all these people who's going to vote for me next time I'm up for a vote.
Yeah.
So he says that all the time.
And honestly, I don't crash the doors. If Margaret tells you the truth, she'll tell you that I'm not going to jail. And I say that at our meetings, our executive committee meetings, more than once. Somebody's got to live to tell the story. It may as well be me. I'm not doing the jail. But I can be the voice of reason. I can look intelligent, so people will allow me to speak. And then I hit it with the machete. But yeah, when you asked about, I guess, the educating piece, we do community meetings, and they're basically community empowerment meetings. We have one scheduled on October the 18th at my church. It's Mount Olivet, 647 North 42nd Street. You're all welcome to come. The area that Mount Olivet is in is really experiencing that gentrification, and really experiencing people being displaced for the sole purpose of tearing down and building new structures that they can't afford to live in. So we do have community meetings. We do ask people to tell their stories. I'm so tired of telling mine, but there are others who have stories similar to mine, and that folks who are affected by the changes that are taking place in the city can relate to. So basically, yeah, we do crash. We showed up in city council when it was time for the vote for the bill to be taken to committee. There were about 200 of us. again, I sat at the front, and I was my sweet loving self. But behind me, folks are holding up signs and ready to kick the chairs down. And that's, I think that we've gotten the attention, and like Rashida said, Councilman Jones really became involved because the tenants union is able to get people's stories out there. We're in conjunction with CLS and TURN trying to make the city see that it's unfair the way people are being treated, that the eviction court process needs to change. And that's basically what we try to do. And we're really good at this.
Sorry, I appreciate
And can I just
that.
mention real quick, if you're interested in seeing these hearings, they're all on YouTube. So City Council has or City of Philadelphia has a YouTube site that records all of the legislative hearings.
So you guys can see, yeah, what's up?
Question. You mentioned that you, Ms. Harvey, that when you were being evicted, that you didn't quite qualify for CLS's help. Were you able to seek a private attorney? Is there like a cause of action where attorneys can recover, fees when they're representing someone in an eviction hearing, or how
No.
did you?
I didn't think so. I know
Not
I wasn't
really.
able to find anyone.
What we were able to do was leverage the fair housing process and help, so you don't need an attorney to represent you in fair housing court, and help for those tenants who we weren't able to represent because of income eligibility or other reasons. We're able to at least guide them through filing their own complaint. And that was a way, because, so just to clarify a little bit, not everybody went through the legal eviction process there. So some people, they did take to court for eviction because of, the situations with rent, if they didn't market right or whatever the case may be. So they did take a number of people to eviction court. Most of the people, though, did not get an eviction notice. They just got a termination notice saying you have to leave on X date, and that they were going to pretty much shut the building down if you didn't leave at that point. So that opened up a whole other issue and challenge for us, because there was not particularly a process by which we could hook them into except fair housing and discrimination. So what I ended up doing is for 8 or 10 of the tenants, I filed an injunction through the Philadelphia Commission for Human Relations based on discrimination, stating that they gave people with vouchers less time to move than they did people who didn't have vouchers. So that was kind of the only way I could hook them in quickly, because, and I didn't even know that the Fair Housing Commission had an injunction process, but I so happened to find it. And so I filed injunctions that were able to stop them from filing any additional evictions and stop them from shutting the building down. And so we then advised other people about how to file that, and a bunch of people did that. And so that also helped to leverage some additional time.
Would love to talk about those injunctions, but
Yeah, fun stuff.
and this is also a great segue. Again, Vivek is not a plant, bringing us to talking about the actual bill that we're trying to talk about, where notice is an incredibly critical part of trying to right the balance of power between tenants and landlord owners. And just to summarize, as we move into kind of the second part of the discussion, we can see how incredibly important it is that different organizations and institutions and people are playing roles to their strengths, and are able to communicate effectively, not only on a local level, but as Rashida had said, I'm sure PTU also talks, outside of Philadelphia, but also on a national level, to try and take advantage of all the resources we can in order to kind of realize what we want to see. So again, that was a great discussion. So we're going to move now into talking about what is on the board, Fight for Just Cause Eviction legislation. If you guys, Rashida or Margaret, if you guys want to kind of give a background of how long it's been going on for, where we're at, and kind of maybe a little background.
Sure. So I'll start off and then I'll pass it to you all. Just by saying, one, the law that governs Pennsylvania's landlord-tenant affairs is the Landlord-Tenant Act. And the Landlord-Tenant Act is very antiquated. I think it was written in 1954. It has not been updated very much since. Every time we do try to update it, there's typically a Republican legislature, and they also try to update it whenever we try to open it up. So it's very dangerous to kind of propose things. But the broader point being that that LT Act governs notice for LT matters in Pennsylvania. And the issue with that LT Act is that it allows you to waive notice of termination. So there's a provision in there that says you have to provide notice. It's called notice to quit in the LT Act, but it's notice of termination. You have to provide notice of termination, and it sets out the timeline. So if you have a lease of more than a year, I think it's 15 days, less than a year, 10 days, or something like that. But then right underneath that, it says this notice can be waived. So of course, every landlord is going to, or a lot of landlords are going to have private leases, and you can't waive notice in a subsidized housing lease. But in a private lease, you're going to waive the notice. I mean, why wouldn't you if you can do that? And no one's going to know that you're doing that, because nobody's going to read the lease and be like, oh, nobody's going to know what that means, essentially, unless you're a lawyer. So a lot of leases get notice waived, which means that a ton of people are not receiving notice when they're up for eviction. So that starts, or not even at the point of eviction, but at the point that you're having some issue with your landlord, either that you fell behind on rent, that there's habitability concerns or repair issues, that you've breached your lease, or that it's the end of your lease term. You don't have to, your landlord does not have to give you notice if you waive the lease. So that's the first issue. So when in a world where most landlords are waiving the lease notice, in a situation like Penn Win, no one's going to get notice, and they happen to give them notice here, but still the notice, whatever, it's 3 months before you move. It was also they trick people into moving, essentially, because again, people didn't know based on their lease agreements whether their lease was actually up in time and they could do this. They just didn't know what their rights were, so it was easy for the landlord to say whatever they want and say you have to leave in 3 months. If people don't know landlord-tenant law, to be like, oh, you can't actually do that.
And Rashida, can you speak towards, and from your experience too, how important notice is in this
it makes all the difference in the world. We have in our municipal court, eviction court, 35% default judgment rate. So that means 35% of the hearing list out of 24,000 people a year, right, facing eviction are not getting notice of their hearing, or somehow notice is defective. So it's not just that they're not getting notice, but it's also that the notice that they are getting is defective, because the court rules require only that you post it and mail it. So you could post it, which means you could post it anywhere in a building, basically. It's supposed to be conspicuous, blah, 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 but it never is. People never see a post-it notice. They actually don't mail the notices out. The court is supposed to be responsible for mailing the notices out. They don't mail them out. So 35% of every list is ending up in default because people either aren't receiving notice or they're receiving defective notice. So that's the reason why it's extremely important, because people are not showing up to court. They're not receiving their just day in court. They're not receiving any type of reason why they're being evicted, because even if you are nice enough to send a notice, you don't have to put the reason in there why you're evicting. So it could be anything. It could be, I don't like the color of your shoes, which actually probably is a valid reason. I mean, not the color of your skin is not a valid reason, of course. That's probably the real reason, right? But it could be anything, and you don't know until you end up in court, and you may not get the notice that you are ending up in court. So lots of reasons for that.
And practically, too, notice may help with transition as well. Having to move, having something sprung on you so quickly can affect your job, what your work is, what your income is, having to take time to find your housing. There's so many practical effects as well.
And there's no public policy reason why notice should be waived and why a landlord shouldn't give notice. There's no public policy reason that I can think of besides pure contract law and whatever you contract.
Maybe even
but
powerful
that's not.
lobbying, but I understand exactly. Yeah. So, and then of course the other part of the bill is this qualified protection that is trying to even out the power balance between these two parties in a court of law. Give a little extra protection to tenants. You have, as a landlord or owner, you have to show this good cause as well.
So So, and I'll pass it on in a second. So just to give a little bit of history about the bill, and you've already talked about this. We, Turn, and CLS a couple years ago, around 2015 or 2014, had approached Councilman Greenlee about introducing legislation, and we drafted something. But he was not willing to do so at the time because part of the issue was that, I think the biggest issue that continues to this day is that landlords consider it to create a perpetual lease term. Typically in a just cause legislation, in order for it to really be effective, the end of the lease term in and of itself should not be a good cause reason to terminate the lease. And so that becomes the central issue for landlords. And so Greenlee didn't really want to deal with that, and it's come back up as an issue, and we're trying to negotiate now around that. But that is the primary issue here and everywhere else where just cause legislation exists, is that landlords believe that it creates a perpetual lease term, and that is the scariest thing in the world to them, even though it lists a billion other reasons and a catch-all category as to why they can terminate the lease agreement. So,
I mean, like, the thing is, there are a lot of reasons that you could legitimately evict someone, and we have like a whole list in the language of the bill, but I'm trying to think what direction I want to be taking this into. Wait, could you repeat your question?
So,
I'm
you
sorry.
know,
I'm not a lawyer, so.
well, Rashida is kind of giving a background on the origination of the bill. Has also given kind of what the opposition is arguing. On the other hand, the opposition is also kind of arguing that there's a disincentivization to develop, that owners will be disincentivized to enter into the rental market, which kind of from what we're talking about today is not the right approach to the housing crisis that we're looking at. It's not that there are not enough, renters. It's that the power imbalance is making kind of both the cultural but also the economic issues in the community that much more torn apart. So
I mean, I guess then like this bill sort of opens up more of a two-sided conversation then. If you don't have to give a reason, then you don't have to defend yourself for whatever reason that you end a lease. And I think one part of the bill that's really important too is the required return of security deposit, because if you do get to name like the reason I need to end this lease is because I'm going to do like a whole gut renovation of my property, then there's no reason you need to keep that security deposit. If you're just going to demo everything in the building, then it doesn't matter what kind of damages the tenant might have caused. And so it sort of like makes gray areas in a way that gives tenants opportunities to actually defend themselves, because they can point at something and be like, no, that's not true. Or this is why I should get a security deposit. And they get the time to think about that too, and the time to get resources.
If you're the person who's being evicted, and you don't get the security deposit back until you've been gone for 15 days and they've had a chance to look it over, and during that, for us, that 3-month period where we were supposed to find other housing, where am I supposed to get the money from to move? In order for me to move, it costs, not including the rental truck and that stuff, but just for me to find someone willing to rent to me, I had to be able to produce $2,400 bidding. And I couldn't, it was not possible for me to continue to pay my rent, to wait for a security deposit, which was in most cases 2 months rent, in order to be able to move. And that was the case for everyone else who was in the building, which is why we pushed for more time to be able to move.
and that's even more critical in a city like Philadelphia. Okay, so now I want to kind of talk about the actual obstacles that you guys have faced, throughout this campaign on the ground, real stories and experiences and how you resolve those issues. And I know there are purely legal issues like preemption that are really important to cover here. There may also be purely kind of organizing issues having to do with, finding the right people to present these arguments, trying to figure out the best strategies to use to kind of get our goal into a reality. And of course, maybe there are also some kind of overlapping issues as well. So do you want to start with preemption or
Sure.
some other kind of legal issues?
Yeah, preemption wasn't an issue. This was something before the legislation was introduced. We had researched again because we had been looking at this for a long time. So I did a memo a couple years ago on preemption issues, state preemption issues. There are none. So we do have the freedom to locally legislate around this particular issue. There are, again, issues, so I'll also say that there is potential state just cause legislation that some local state reps are looking to introduce, potentially Morgan Cephas, whose district this was also in, as well as another state rep who's thinking about, I've been pushing him towards. So let me just back up to say that there's another building in West Philly, two buildings called Dorset and Admiral Court that underwent a similar issue of mass eviction. And so out of that, again, talking about the reactionary kind of ways in which legislatures act, this legislator introduced a bill that his intentions were great, which was to basically, he introduced a bill that said that you can't waive any important rights in your lease agreement. But again, it would have been really cool to have it be narrowly focused to strike that waiver of notice provision that I was just telling you all about, because it's just it's literally like a sentence that gives the landlord so much power. So I was able to discuss this with him, and this is a place where I actually drafted the legislation that would strike the provision and gave it to him, and wrote up this memo about public policy of not having a waiver provision. So we'll see where that goes. This legislative period is very short. It's shorter than other ones. They only have a couple of days on the Hill, so I don't know that it would be introduced this period, but maybe next one. But yeah, so preemption wasn't really an issue. The challenges are more so on the ground, I think, with other landlords, and with them obviously not liking any additional tenant protections, and the refrain that you hear from landlords is contract law, constitutional law, I have the right to contract, which nobody has the right to tell me how to contract, which is completely untrue for any other area of law. Like you can regulate a contract, so I think that's been the biggest challenge. And again, in particular, this idea that having a just cause protection creates a perpetual lease term, even though it doesn't. I mean, it feels like, and I can understand logically how they reach that conclusion, but it doesn't really. I mean, it creates other outs that are legitimate to end the lease agreement, and also just, so I think that's the main issue.
And do you expect there to be, like, let's say we go through this process, just cause is passed, do you expect there to be a kind of response in the courts challenging it in that way, in those ways that you kind of were saying?
Well, so at this moment, we're all negotiating, so we may be able to get it to a place that's acceptable for multiple parties, and PTU is at the table, we're at the table.
Right.
That would be the goal, although it's not the first goal, obviously, because to do that is going to water down the bill in a way that makes it less effective, right? But we also want to do it in a way strategically that, yeah, we may not get everything we want, but we can scale up at some point, so leave the door open to be able to build on what we do pass. So that's a particular way of approaching it. We could go for the whole thing and say we're not going to accept anything less, but the likelihood is that it's not going to get passed. And
right. And your knowledge and expertise, and you were just talking about that kind of, that one line, like if we could just get rid of that one line, things would be okay. Then you know what you're negotiating for, and you know maybe what you can give up to kind of get to that spot where that equilibrium where we can get things done.
Sure.
So for PTU, the sorts of obstacles that grassroots organizations have to deal with in this process.
Yeah, I mean, being kind of a rogue body, just like making sure that we're updated on the policy that we're
Yeah,
advocating.
you guys are on your own.
It's always sort of an obstacle. I think we're pretty good at communication, but sometimes it just doesn't happen. Yeah, I think also just things innate in being an all-volunteer organization, like people take off work to go to city council hearings in order to testify.
Did you take off work to come here today?
Yeah, I'm on PTO right now.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and I mean, my office is a few blocks from City Hall, so I just had a lot of like suspiciously long lunches last year, and I just like run out after the formal meeting is over. But I have PTO. I have the privilege of being able to just leave work sometimes, and a lot of people don't. And so when things are rescheduled last minute, that is extremely hurtful to us. And it's really difficult to get that same capacity to come out in the next time.
It can be a strategic method to be used against you. It also sounds like.
Oh
possible.
yeah, and it is. It's done all the time. Yeah, and then I think just some of the arguments that like landlord lobbies and maybe more conservative council people bring up are things that we need to have responses to. I know that at one point there was talk about just limiting the bill to apply to landlords that had like 10 or more properties, and so then we had to find statistics on how many properties most landlords, we basically broke down how many properties every landlord in Philadelphia had, and then we had to present that data and be like, no, this won't, this will only protect like a quarter of the people that we're trying to protect if you made that limitation. So like, give us a better argument against this legislation. And yeah, they keep arguing the contract thing. But
Ms. Harvey, do you have any sorts of obstacles? I mean, it must be, in one sense, the emotion involved can make it hard for people to even come forward
Yes.
and address what's going on.
Yeah, certainly I'm convinced that I was taken to court 3 times because I was become an active and vocal member of the tenants union advocating for the Penn win. I think it's important to also note the effect that just cause, or the lack of just cause legislation has on children and families. There were several children in the Penn building, but I can speak to my granddaughter who was 12 at the time, and a straight A student until this process, the eviction process started. I have smaller grandchildren who, they thought it was great because now everything's in one place and they're with grandma so I can get them out of trouble. And it could just be fun to sleep in sleeping bags. But for my 12-year-old, her grades plummeted from straight A's to C's. And it's important that we give children a voice. And the issue with Admiral Dorset, there are many, many children who live in that building who attend a school right across the street. But still, when your living situation is being uprooted and you really don't know where you're going to go, and you sense the stress of whomever your parent or caregiver is, then it affects you in ways, or affects children in ways that it takes them months and maybe even years to recover from, and that damages society. It just makes sense to me. But remember, I'm a social worker, so I see things differently than legislators.
Yeah.
Even structures like the schedule of city council hearings is innately limiting and inaccessible. I mean, like, I went to school in Charlottesville for 4 years, and their city council meetings are in the evening. So people could just go after work and engage in
Right.
democracy. So it's like, why don't we just do that here?
And then, I guess lastly, where are we at with the bill and what's going on right now?
Under negotiation, yeah, so we're scheduled, all of us, next month to have a meeting with Councilman Jones and with the landlords and the Realtor Association, HAPCO, to discuss negotiations on the bill. So it is likely that it will be amended, and again, what we think of as less effective, but what we hope we'll be able to compromise and build on as we go forward. The issue, not an issue, but this is just Curtis Jones's strategy. He wants all 12 city council votes. He does not want not a nary a vote against. So that's challenging, and it pushes the timeline, when you have to cater to everyone on city council as opposed to getting only a portion of the votes that's going to get us there. So that's what we've been dealing with, and that's why it's been challenging and why we have to make so many compromises with the other side to get it to a place where Councilman Jones thinks it's going to get all the votes. So.
Guys, what a wonderful and engaging conversation. Join me, please. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Do people have questions?
Well, what I thought, if you have questions, feel free to just come down, ask them individually. We're just about kind of done. I don't want to keep you guys any longer. So, again, round of applause, please. And you guys, if you have questions, just come down and ask. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you so much, guys.